Hi everyone, and welcome back to our final Seraphim live webinar of 23. I'm really pleased to welcome back to the stream today Seraphim investors, Dr. Maureen Haverty and Lucas Bishop. Hi both.
Hi Leah, hi everyone.
Thanks for joining me today. 2023 has been a surprisingly upbeat year for the sector, despite economic uncertainties. And today, we're here to find out from the experts what they think is going to happen across 2024 for the space sector. And also, we're going to take a little brief look back at 23 and see if our predictions from last year were correct. So, and as we go along, as always, we love to take questions from the audience. We'll try and take some of them along the way, but we'll mainly pick them up at the end of the Q&A. So, Maureen, I'll go over to you first today. So, first question, we're going to talk about geopolitics. Next year, the escalating geopolitical landscape, we believe, will intensify global governments to bolster their independent space capabilities. We're already seeing new space agencies popping up all over the world, something that we did predict for 2023. Can you explain a little bit more about this activity and why it's important and who you think the key players will be?
Yeah, so I think when we think about space sovereignty, we need to think about two aspects. First of all, military and intelligence capability, and then maybe more commercial activity and civil activity. So we've seen this year, we saw last year that space is increasingly important for military and intelligence capability. And I think a lot of governments are really starting to think about that. In general, some of those activities tend to obviously then be led by the military or by intelligence organizations. So definitely increased focus on that internationally. And then we also have a lot of governments who feel that space is increasingly important generally for their way of life and for civil activity. They see it as a potentially very large money earner. They see it as important to their economies, and they don't want to be left behind, particularly they don't want to be left behind by the US. So we've seen a lot of focus on space sovereignty from the European Union, but also from a lot of countries throughout the world. And in general, activities that are focused on civil or commercial activity tend to be led by space agencies. And sometimes we have countries that have had very little previous space activity. They launch a space agency because they don't want to be left behind, but maybe they don't want to commit to enormous investment. So a space agency might allow them to be an intelligent customer. It might allow them to help build up a talent pool or an ecosystem, or generally learn a lot more about space. So essentially they're protecting themselves from being left behind in space. So just to remind everyone, there's some, interesting, so there's lots of countries that actually have space agencies that they brought in after they had significant space activity. So the UK only established its space agency in 2010, even though, for example, with Airbus and its predecessor, Astro, has had a large amount of space activity for a very long time. Rocket Lab was founded in New Zealand before New Zealand set up its own space agency. And we just hosted a delegation of space agencies from Africa in our offices, and there's a lot of activity going on there, for example, the Rwandan Space Agency. So we think generally governments are going to focus more on space sovereignty next year.
Brilliant. Thank you, Maureen. Thanks for that. Lucas, over to you. In 2023, we expected we'd see regulators implementing further restrictions as space sustainability became a priority for agencies and regulators across the globe. Did this happen? And was there any further progress made to ensure that space can remain sustainable?
Yeah, pretty much exactly. So 2023 saw one of the first enforcements of space sustainability regulations. So the US, the FCC there, issued its first ever fine for space debris. So this was to Dish Networks, which was fined 150K when they failed to move their satellite EchoStar 7 completely into its graveyard orbit. The satellite was performing an orbital maneuver intending to take it 180 miles from its geostationary orbit, but the satellite lost fuel, was only able to complete 76 miles of this maneuver, and ultimately the company received a fine. So going forward, I think we can anticipate that this is only going to happen an increasing amount, and enforcement is probably going to be increasingly the norm going forward. People might wonder what this means more broadly for businesses kind of addressing in-orbit services. I think at least in the short term, a lot of these businesses are too far away for us to sort of directly see an impact of people starting to think about, deorbiting missions and doing specific missions for that. But it might shore up some business cases related to in-orbit servicing and orbital maneuvers in the future. But all things considered, I think we can just expect regulation to play an increasing role going forward as it's starting to be enforced.
Awesome. Thank you, Lucas, for covering that. Maureen, this year we had a steadfast commitment, which is great for the industry, from the Department of Defense to buy, they said, I think, buy what we can build and build what we must. And we predict that this will have a profound influence on the sector. What does this mean for the space industry as a whole?
Yeah, so that's a Space Force acquisition strategy that came out of General Raymond gave a speech, late in 2022. So basically, it's the idea of buy what we can, build what we must. So the Department of Defense and Space Force specifically is saying we want to buy products and services from the commercial sector if it's available. If what we need is available, we should buy it, and potentially, we should really try to make our needs match what's available from the commercial sector. And then if we have to, we have the ability and we're willing to actually go and build something specific and pay someone to do that for us. I think that's an incredibly important thing for the commercial sector, because obviously the US government and Space Force is a potentially huge customer. It's a major source of revenue coming into the commercial industry. I think taking it one step further, it's really important for the new space sector, is that it seems to be that Space Force and the DoD increasingly wants to behave like any other customer, as in we'll buy an existing product. We're not going to come in with new requirements and require you to build something new, even though it's just a replication of what you already have. And that's really important for new space, because a lot of new space is built on the idea of we have a product, it's scalable to a wide variety of customers, and we can just scale up very quickly and easily. And I think that really helps those companies stick to their business model rather than having to build anything unique.
Yeah, so what were they doing before? They would just do it all in-house? They wouldn't...
So basically... they would not do it in-house. They would have, let's say they would go to a Boeing or a Lockheed or a Raytheon, and they would have them build them something to their unique specifications, normally on a cost plus model. So it's your cost plus some profit, and it would really go to the scenario that, if there's cost overruns, that's fine. The government's going to pay for it. If we change specifications, you'll allow us to change specifications, but the bill is constantly mounting. I mean, as a taxpayer, I don't like that approach. It's not massively efficient. And then also, so cost mount up, lots of new design, non-recurring engineering going on. It's not an efficient way to do anything. Whereas now there's much more of a drive in the Department of Defense in the US, but I think really from governments globally is, no, you give firm fixed price contracts to your commercial customers. That's what we want. So I believe space development agencies, transport layers are all done on a firm fixed price basis. What happens then is that if the government comes in and says, or any customer, if you're on a firm fixed price contract, says, oh, I want to make a change, it's like, no, you got a firm fixed price contract, and it would involve generally a full renegotiation of the contract if you want to change requirements. That's very price efficient, because most customers will say, okay, that's fine, I'll back off. But also it keeps you you're more likely to stick to schedule as well, because the changing of requirements over time obviously leads to delays.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like great news for a lot of our portfolio companies. Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, Maureen. Lucas, talk about M&A activity in the space sector. We've seen, you reported that from our index that it's been on the rise. Apparently the surge in deal volume for 2023 is primarily propelled by well-capitalized new space inquirers. We saw record-breaking numbers with 29 SpaceTech deals in the last 12 months leading up to Q3. What are you predicting that we'll see in 24?
Yeah, so to date in 2023, as you said, we've seen just an increasing amount of M&A activity, largely driven by these well-capitalized new space acquirers. I think we only see this trend of consolidation continuing. I think we continue to anticipate that it's going to be driven by the larger and more well-capitalized among the new space businesses, consolidating a lot of the smaller players. I think in terms of private equity activity, obviously 23 saw quite a lot of interesting deals. We saw Maxar and OHB both taken private by private equity firms. I think we could see in 2024 a couple of potential take private deals. So we've already seen that Astra has had an offer from its management to take that business private. We've also seen just today some conflicting rumors and speculation that Tehran could be considering a take private transaction as well. And I think that's likely not just for those two, but also for some of the other underperforming SpaceTech SPACs. So I think potentially seeing a couple of take private transactions might be something we see going into the next year.
And Maureen, what about the public markets? What do you think we're going to witness for the public markets in 24?
Okay, so first of all, what happens in the public markets is definitely a broader question than space. And I think the biggest driver of whether any space company goes public next year is just the status of the IPO market. So, we felt the IPO markets, the general investor community, the wider markets have felt the IPO market has been closed. ARM had a very large IPO, and then, but that's had some mixed results. So share price fell 25% from its IPO price, has recovered now. So it's actually trading slightly above its IPO price. But I guess it's not quite definitive yet that means the IPO markets are open next year or whether they're closed next year. But if they're open, I think we could see a number of space IPOs. SpaceX is clearly the most hotly anticipated one. It's unclear yet whether that's going to be a full SpaceX IPO or probably more likely an IPO of the Starlink business unit. And I think we could see a number of others maybe joining them. However, I think whenever the IPO markets do reopen, I think it's probably going to be the year after where we see most of the space companies potentially IPOing. And I think obviously CEOs are very, very, very carefully considering whether they want to be on the public markets, given what's happened with some of the deep SPACs where even the best performing, as in, the business is doing really well, are really being hammered on their share price. And I think that will obviously give a lot of CEOs pause for thought.
Yeah, makes sense. And mentioning SpaceX, we'll talk about SpaceX with Lucas. In 2023, we predicted that SpaceX would become a competitor for all. How do you think that what did you think they achieved in 2023? Did they have as much growth as you thought? And tell us a little bit more about your opinion on that.
Yeah, well, in recent years, SpaceX has clearly been expanding their offering outside of just rocket launch. We all know with Starlink, with Dragon, resupply missions, and human spaceflight, as well as straying into defense with Starshield. So I think while many businesses have assumed that they wouldn't be competitive to SpaceX, and while SpaceX has, at least throughout 2023, kind of maintained with themselves within this kind of remit, I think it would be fair for anyone to have a relatively uneasy feeling, as SpaceX does have more than the capacity to expand into other adjacent markets up and down the value chain and also horizontally. Worries could also be compounded by speculation around a potential IPO. I mean, SpaceX is more than in a good position to go public, even just a division, given that they're the largest private US company and Starlink itself is cash flow break even. So I would say not a competitor to all quite yet, but it's worthwhile businesses remaining very vigilant.
Thanks. And Maureen, if Lucas has just said it's probably going to be a pivotal year for SpaceX, what's your opinion? on the potential IPO? And if they do manage to IPO, how do you think that could impact the rest of the industry? Can you hear me? Oh.
Yes. Sorry. So yeah, absolutely. So it's quite a tough question. So what do I think of the potential IPO? I mean, I think it's potentially very exciting. I think it will be interesting to see how. And one of the things I was going to say is, I think CEOs might have paused for thought if they've got any significant testing that could have very public failures associated with it, because that's definitely something that the de-SPACs have been punished for if they still had a lot of development left to do. And I think that will be really interesting to see is how a company like SpaceX, which is always doing development and always very publicly doing development, how the public markets respond to that and the impact on its share price. And potentially that could influence them wanting to take Starlink public and then keep SpaceX itself, which has maybe more development left to do and potentially more public failures left to complete, and keeping that private to avoid the share price being affected. Overall, I think the reaction to the Starship launch attempts have been extremely interesting to watch, and I think might provide a good indication of how the public markets would react. I think for many in the general public who are not space enthusiasts, they've probably only really become very familiar with SpaceX in the last year or two. And really that's when SpaceX has become, operationally excellent. They're looking at rock solid reliability of the Falcon 9. People have probably never even heard that Falcon 9 had any failures, Falcon 1 had any failures. They're unfamiliar with the history of the business. And they're just used to, wow, we're launching rockets once a week, twice a week, it's on the same day. They're used to that kind of operational excellence. So they're used to operational SpaceX rather than development SpaceX, and what's happening with Starship, obviously, that it's still in development. I think even in a broader sense, many people have a very limited understanding of the number of failures that happen in test in any new product or any new science or engineering being developed. Apple has failures, they're behind closed doors, so does Google, et cetera, et cetera. SpaceX's tests and rockets blow up in public, and I think that's been interesting to watch. I think the space sector has been really impressed by Starship and how quickly it's progressing. I certainly have, and I'm unsure as to when Starship will launch, or will launch successfully, but I think it's probably quicker than certainly I think it's quicker than I thought it was 6 months ago. I'm starting to make kind of casual bets with colleagues, and I'm optimistic about when it's going to happen. So I think overall we're going to see more and more great things from SpaceX, and probably the most exciting things will come from them really focusing on space as a business.
Yeah, it was really interesting to see how kind of the mainstream press were talking about the launches compared to kind of the space trade press, where we all saw it as a win, and they were kind of just pulling out the as the top line the kind of the negatives. So I think that's it was really interesting to see how that played out.
It was fascinating. It was fascinating to see how negative the headlines were. If you went to the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, and it's like. It was like, are we watching the same thing?
Yeah.
And obviously we are. It's just we're all like, well, it's not going to get to orbit. It's not meant to get to orbit, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And if anyone wants to ask us questions, please don't wait till the end. We're happy to pop them in the chat now, and we can pick them up as we go along. And because we might get a few too many at the end. So if you want your question answered, please get in early. Lucas, I'll go back over to you. We'll talk about the moon, because again, the moon has been in the press all year, and we expect a lot more from it. It continues to be an important stepping stone to gain insights and access to our solar system and beyond. 2024, we see the next leap into the commercial lunar market. Who do you think will be the next big key players from both the sovereign nations and private companies?
Yeah, so the main player, at least in the short term, is obviously NASA. So the Artemis program is well underway in taking humanity basically back to the lunar surface, and this time to establish a bit more of a permanent presence. Artemis 1 has already been completed, and I forget the timelines for Artemis 2 and 3, but it's shortly in the coming years. NASA is, not just doing this alone. They're using a lot of help. They're issuing a lot of contracts to primes and even startups to address various parts of lunar infrastructure. So, there are contracts for the Lunar Gateway, the Human Landing System, which was to SpaceX, lunar landers, and even early tendering for lunar rover contracts. So lots of activity on that side, and it's all obviously being spearheaded initially by NASA. On the commercial side, we're seeing activity underway as well. 2023, we were supposed to see 3 commercial landers make their way to the lunar surface. Ultimately, we've only seen 1 launch this year, which I guess is somewhat unsurprising because things in space often take longer than anticipated. So iSpace, a Japanese company, made an attempted landing, which unfortunately experienced a crash. We were also expecting to see Astrobotic. They were actually intending to launch their Peregrine lander aboard ULA this Christmas Eve, but that's now been pushed back to January, just outside of 2023. And we also were expecting Intuitive Machines to launch, but again, this has also been pushed back into early 2024. Intuitive Machines, another business that went public via SPAC. So yeah, on the commercial side, a few of the businesses that are spearheading commercial lunar work. I think the moon is also very much on China's roadmap. Off the top of my head, I can't remember the time frames in which they're looking to establish a presence on the lunar surface, but it's very much on their roadmap, and it's increasingly, I think, something that will start to make the headlines as they progress.
Yeah, but awesome, thank you. And what about explain to everyone, from a strategic and resource perspective, like why is the moon holding so much importance for both private and sovereign nations?
Yeah, so I think people see the moon as a very good stepping stone into deep space. It's potentially a good refueling stop for deep space exploration. So there's frozen ice on the lunar poles, which in theory could be mined and used for rocket fuel to propel satellites and spacecraft into deep space, and also potentially to support humans. Could also use the lunar regolith for industry for building on the lunar surface. There's talk about mining the lunar surface for helium-3, which is potentially an ideal fuel for fusion. But I think the timelines for genuine resource extraction, utilization of these materials is something that will only really commence in the it'll be the next decade before that kicks off in earnest. But a flavor of some of the interest in the moon's resources there.
Thank you. So the race to the moon is on. Maureen, let's talk about return to Earth. Just as we always talk about how low-cost launch has reshaped the space sector over the last decade, we are anticipating that low-cost, frequent return to Earth capabilities will have a similar impact over the next decade. Can you explain what this means and what it means in the near term as well? What might we see next year?
So return to Earth technology is basically when something is returned to Earth from space intact. So this already happens with some of the rocket boosters, SpaceX's Dragon capsule, or the Soyuz vehicle, often from the ISS. What's happening now, what we think we're going to see a lot more of next year, is that there's a lot of new startups who have their own, who are returning things to Earth for lots of different reasons. Some of them are going to host life sciences experiments and manufacturing and return the results to Earth for further analysis or even for sale. Some of them are going to manufacture materials, again, for the same purpose. And some of them are doing either hypersonics testing, so it's coming in back at hypersonic velocity, and the government can use it to test hypersonics, and also for point-to-point cargo. So there's some who are planning, that militaries will be able to drop something in the space to one side of the Earth, from one side of the Earth to the other in the space of an hour or a couple of hours by launching into space and then returning it to Earth. So there's lots of different potential applications. I'm obviously really excited about our portfolio company, Atmos, which we invested into during the summer. So Atmos is a German seed stage company, and the CEO, Sebastian, served several tours of duty in Afghanistan with the parachute division, parachuting behind enemy lines from, very high altitude planes, et cetera. And he used that, interest in parachutes to develop their own novel patented return technology based on parachutes. And they're also hosting life sciences experiments and manufacturing on their independent satellite that they'll return to Earth for their customers, because I think that's the largest, we believe the same, that it's the largest first market, but they can actually scale up their technology to return much larger vehicles as well. So it's quite a flexible technology. So we're excited by that. We're really excited by the team. We're really excited by their ambition, how quickly they're planning their first launch.
Awesome. I know something that you're really interested in yourself as well, and we do as a team, is the realm of microgravity in space. It's not just a science curiosity, it's not kind of science fiction, it's a potential gold mine for groundbreaking advancements in the life sciences. How do you think this will progress in 2024 and see advancements in this R&D in space sector?
Okay, so microgravity is just a really fascinating concept, but more importantly, it's having real world applications as in terrestrial applications. So microgravity basically means that in space, in the LEO environment, the effect of gravity is reduced to 10 to the minus 6. So essentially, the effect of gravity is close to zero, and that has a profound impact on everything, really, on how materials form, tissues behave, organ growth, lots of different things. So it's really not just science fiction. It's not just theoretical. Over 3,000 microgravity experiments have been performed on the International Space Station since its launch, and 2,000 of those are life sciences experiments, investigating all of those behaviors and often using those behaviors to direct, behaviors that you want. So some really interesting examples include the fact that Keytruda, one of the world's best-selling drugs, it's a monoclonal antibody drug, it's a cancer drug, it generates $18 billion a year in revenue. Merck reformulated that to make it injectable rather than intravenous on the International Space Station. So there's some really important research with real-world applications happening there. The other really nice thing about life sciences in space is that generally life sciences things, whether they're drugs or their organs or their tissues, they're really expensive. And the volumes are actually, in many cases, for a lot of drugs or for a lot of tissues, the volumes required are not that high. So the volume aligns well with what we can do in space now, and with all the new return to Earth capacity that's growing, and also the price point of the cost of launching and returning it actually aligns really well. There would actually not really be any negative impact on pricing or the cost of producing any of these drugs in space. It's actually, they align well. So that's why we're generally interested in the sector. We think we've made two what we call picks and shovels investments, so enabling technology investments in the area in the last 18 months. First of all, in Voyager, who are doing a space station, and they're really focused on actual science and manufacturing in space. And then obviously in Atmos, who I just spoke about. But there are a number of companies in the sector, and they're more forming all the time, that I think are really interesting. So there's Yuri out of Germany, who are looking at synthetic biology. So the behavior of bacteria changes in space, and that has applications for SynBio. Space Pharma, who are an Israeli-Swiss company, who are doing drug reformulation in space, and we think they're going to be one of the first pharma companies enabled by space. And people probably will have heard of Varda, who are combining, they're doing a return to Earth technology, and they're also doing the life sciences. That given themselves a lot of challenges. So there's 3 companies that we think are quite interesting in the space.
Awesome, that's fascinating stuff. Thanks, Maureen. Lucas, in 2023, we predicted that some of the largest private investments would occur. Were we right on that? Can you explain to everyone a few of the significant rounds that we witnessed this year?
Yeah, so I think that prediction was made on the back of the second half of 2022, where we basically saw no or very few large growth rounds as the economic uncertainty caused pretty much, a bit of a halt in growth investing. So throughout 2023, we've pretty much seen a continuously increasing trajectory of in terms of investment. We've seen growth rounds starting to reappear pretty much across the board, albeit these are generally smaller than the ones that we saw in late 2021 and early 2022. So at the very peak of the market. Investment is recovering, and this is mainly as a result of a larger number of slightly smaller rounds. But I think in terms of saying that we expect some of the largest investments to occur, may have slightly missed the mark on that one. So in this year, I mean, we saw SpaceX raise 700 million, which is a bit less than their 1.7 billion in 2022, and Sierra also raised a further 290 versus their 1.4 billion in Q4 2021. We've seen other big rounds this year. So Axiom raised 350 million to fund their private space station. But broadly, I think the theme that we're seeing across businesses that raise these the largest rounds this year, any rounds which are 100 million plus, is that they're pretty much all focused on relatively capitally intensive businesses. So rockets, constellations, space stations, and people addressing the in-space economy. So just a flavor of the largest rounds this year included Astranis, so a business launching micro-geo satellites, ESA Aerospace, which was actually the largest non-US deal, a German company that raised 165 million as part of their Series C. And we also saw as a major Kepler and Voyager all raise rounds in and around $100 million.
Awesome, thank you, Lucas. Yeah, I think it was probably hard to predict that at that point. So I think we did a pretty good job. So we'll see what 2024 holds. Maureen, also in 2023, cell phone activity in space, 5G in space was huge news, and we predicted companies like Apple and SpaceX were targeting this area to be the next big thing in connectivity. Where is the industry in a whole now with 5G from space? Is it where we thought it should be? Is it where it should be?
Yes, actually. So I think this was an interesting prediction because, we made the prediction and actually there are a huge number of announcements in January, February, March, actually. So it felt like it was coming true quite quickly. So we've had, so first of all, but I think, the fact is that there are no new phones. There are no phones that have been released with a competitive technology to Apple's SOS yet, or improved technology, which is maybe potentially what we were thinking. And obviously that's not going to happen this year. However, I'm positive about next year, and there's a couple of reasons why. But just Iridium and Qualcomm had a fairly public partnership where, mobile phones could use Qualcomm chip and it would be tied into the Iridium network so they could use that for satellite capability. And they recently canceled that program. It seems that mobile phone manufacturers really didn't want to be tied into, just a single source. It wasn't a 3GPP standards compliant chip, and people didn't like that. So that ultimately had poor uptake and they canceled the program. But we've seen actually a number of developments. So AST and Vodafone, just I think 1 month ago, had the first 5G call from space. which is pretty exciting to have that level of capability. Link has started deploying its initial tech service in the Solomon Islands. And then finally, Skylo, I think probably making some of the biggest progress towards deploying this globally, has announced partnerships with every major chipset company. So MediaTek, Qualcomm, Samsung, Sony, which means it can now be deployed in handsets. So it really could be quite soon when we start seeing this, now that they've actually, have those partnerships and they're far progressed enough that they're able to announce them publicly. So I think we're definitely getting there.
Awesome. Thank you, Maureen. I don't know if anyone wants to take a question from Daniel. Shall I read that one out? I don't know if he wants to pick that one up. What does the future of traditional and relatively costly launch providers like ULA and Arianespace, look like? Will they become completely government? Yeah, will they become completely government dependent, or do they have a fighting chance in the commercial markets?
I think it's going to be really challenging for these companies. So first of all, I want to say is that there is no rocket launch company that doesn't have the government, no successful rocket launch company that doesn't have the government as a really key customer. So there's no shame in that. SpaceX gets a lot of business from the government. So that's absolutely fine. But I mean, SpaceX is just doing so well. It just is launching so regularly. It's booked out all of its transporter missions. Its price is so low. Sometimes it might be difficult to deal with, but the price is right. And I think, we have a portfolio of space companies, and I often hear from, launch providers, they're like, oh, price isn't important. And it's like, really? I mean, it's really important. Like, that's what startups care about. I think it's going to be really hard for, startups, businesses, mature businesses, that's what people care about, is the price. Can they actually afford to launch their satellites and launch their constellation? And I think in a high interest rate environment where, cost of capital is much higher, that becomes even more of a concern. How can I reduce the cost of my constellation? How can I reduce the cost of my launches? And I think that is still going to be the key metric on what launch providers are being based. And ULA and Arianespace have always been traditionally extremely expensive. So I think they're going to be some of the most challenged. Having said that, I think they probably will get government contracts because of where they are in the industry. So I think but I would struggle to see them getting a lot of commercial work.
Thanks, Maureen, and thanks, Daniel, for your question. Lucas, we'll go back to the Q&A. Affected this year by economic uncertainty, we saw that SpaceTech deals continued throughout 2023 strongly. What are we predicting for 2024? Will this trajectory continue?
Yeah, so I think we're seeing pretty positive signals in terms of recovery. So investment is bouncing back and has been doing so for the last 2-3 previous quarters. When you look at it on a trailing 12-month basis, we've seen growth rounds start to return. So I guess increased confidence in the sector, again, as economic uncertainty starts to fade away a little bit. I think one thing that I look at that particularly stands out to me is that we've seen a really continued and strong growth in just the number of deals, particularly a lot at the early stages, so pre-seed and seed deals, which indicates to me that there's a higher level than ever before of underlying activity within the new space economy. And inevitably, the strongest of these startups in the next year or two are going to start moving into those slightly larger rounds, the Series A's, the Series B's. So my sense is that broadly, we're going to see a continued upward trend in investment from where we are today, both in terms of deals and in terms of dollars. So one thing we've noticed is also an increasing trend towards increasingly global representation in these rounds. I've just seen a question in the comments about India, but we've seen broadly Asian investment and number of deals is increasing more rapidly than we're currently seeing growth in the US and likewise in Europe. So That would be the other trend I'd call out, that increasingly global representation in the startups that are raising as well.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Lucas. And I'm sure, obviously, India are buzzing after their moon landing, and I think that, the interest over there must be absolutely huge. And I'm sure we're going to see that from a lot of other nations when they're trying to do something similar. Anybody got any other questions? I think we've come to the end of our Q&A. Or anything you want to add, Maureen or Lucas? Anything we might have missed or you want to say? Oh.
I guess actually just wanted to touch a little bit more on the different countries like India, because I'm just so enthusiastic about what's coming out of India. I mean, first of all, India has a massive head start on most other countries in the space sector. Israel are like full of top tier engineers. They've always had a really strong space heritage. They had the PSLV launcher, which is really competitive with SpaceX, and was a preferred destination for rideshare missions for quite some time. So really has a lot of the key things to get a commercial space sector started. And then so a lot of engineers are really great, quite a commercial mindset, and then they've gone out and started a lot of startups. So we've got our own portfolio company, Pixel, who are a real big success story doing hyperspectral imaging and also very much selling to the world. They have contracts from the US government, from the DoD, I believe, for really quite significant contracts. So really excited by them. There's also Skyroot Aerospace, a new launch provider, and Drew the Space, who are doing satellites as well in space. So very excited by the opportunities there.
Definitely brilliant. Oh yeah, Pixel, an awesome company that we had the pleasure of meeting in our offices back in July. That was brilliant. Anything else you want to add, Lucas or Maureen, before we call it a day? Oh, we got a couple more questions coming in before I think we'll take maybe one more. Maureen, do you want to pick one?
Yeah. Let's do the dedicated launches one, because I have opinions. I think it's really challenging. Because it's just really expensive. It's really expensive to have a dedicated launch, and who are really the main customers for dedicated launch? It's governments, it's military, specifically for things like responsive launch, or they want the privacy and the security on the launch, or they just want to dictate the terms. And that's really the customer. And so there's limited growth opportunity with the commercial market. There's limited opportunity to, what SpaceX has done very successfully, and which is, take my government contracts, use that to raise capital, use that to fund my development, and then provide a commercial offering and continue to serve government customers as well. Really hard to do that with dedicated launch. So I think it's challenging.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think we're definitely out of time now. We've gone a little bit over time. But thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you everyone who listened. And this will be recorded, and you'll be able to watch it again on our LinkedIn channel. So if you have further questions following the live, the team will be happy to go in and answer for you. But we hope that some of the things we say are right for 2024, and we'll do it again at the end. And let's see. And I hope you see you there again. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers.